An unknown woman wrote, "Your husband and I have been together for 4 years. I'm pregnant with his child." My husband was asleep beside me. I quietly made one phone call. When she opened the door, she immediately went pale. "Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say they would know. They say it with such confidence. I would know if my husband was cheating. I would feel it. I would see it. I used to say that too. I used to believe it. That was before the night I lay in bed next to my husband of 11 years and read a message from a woman I had never heard of. A woman who told me she was carrying his child. But let me start from before that night. Let me start from when life still made sense. My name is Claire Whitfield. I'm 41 years old and I lived, in a 4-bedroom house in a quiet suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm a high school English teacher. I grade papers at the kitchen table. I make pot roast on Sundays. I know all my neighbors by name. My life was not glamorous. It was not the life I had imagined at 22, full of travel and spontaneity. But it was solid. It was real. It was mine. My husband Daniel was a civil engineer. He worked for a mid-sized firm downtown, the kind of steady, respectable job that comes with a pension plan and a parking pass. We had 2 kids, Lily, 14, and Mason, 11. We had a golden retriever named Biscuit who slept at the foot of our bed. We had a mortgage, a shared Netflix password, and a standing date night every other Friday. We were fine. That was the word I used most often when people asked about us. We're fine. Looking back now, I understand that fine was the problem. Fine is what happens when you stop paying attention. The first sign came in the spring of last year. Daniel started staying late at work. Not dramatically late. Not the kind of late that triggers alarm bells. 1 hour, sometimes 2. He always had a reason. A deadline, a client meeting, a site visit that ran long. I didn't question it. He was a responsible man. He had always been responsible. Then came the phone. He had never been secretive about his phone before. We were that couple that knew each other's passcodes. Not because we were suspicious, but because it simply didn't matter. One evening in June, I picked up his phone from the counter to check the time. My hands were full of dish soap. And he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took it from me. Gently, with a smile. "I've got it, babe," he said. I told myself it was nothing. In August, I noticed a receipt in his jacket pocket while I was doing laundry. Dinner for 2 at a restaurant I'd never heard of. 47 miles from our house. When I asked him about it, he said it was a client lunch. I pointed out it was a Saturday. He said the client had been in town only on the weekend. He said it without blinking. I told myself it was nothing. In October, he started going to the gym. Daniel had not voluntarily entered a gym in 6 years. He bought new clothes, nothing extravagant but fitted. He started using cologne on Tuesday mornings. I told myself it was nothing. That is the thing about loving someone for 11 years. You become very good at talking yourself out of the truth. The message came on a Thursday night in November. Daniel had fallen asleep early, which was unusual for him. He normally stayed up past midnight watching sports. I remember thinking he looked almost peaceful lying there, one arm thrown over his eyes, breathing slowly. I was sitting up in bed, scrolling through my phone, when the notification appeared. It came through Instagram. a direct message from an account I didn't recognize. The profile photo showed a woman, dark-haired, perhaps 30, smiling in what looked like a kitchen. Her name was listed as Renata Voss. The message said, "We've been together for 4 years. I'm pregnant with his baby." I thought you should know. I read it 3 times. Then I read it a 4th. Daniel was asleep 6 inches away from me. I could hear him breathing. I could feel the warmth coming off his body. The dog stirred at the foot of the bed. My hands were not shaking. That surprised me most. I had always imagined that if something like this happened, I would fall apart immediately. Cry, scream, wake him up. Instead, I felt something close to ice settling in my chest, a cold, clarifying stillness. I set the phone face down on my nightstand. I lay back against my pillow and stared at the ceiling for a long time. And then, very quietly, I made one phone call. I called my sister. Angela picked up on the second ring, which meant she was still awake, probably watching one of her crime documentaries with a glass of wine. She's 3 years older than me and has never been married, which she describes as either her greatest wisdom or her greatest tragedy, depending on the day. "Claire?" Her voice shifted immediately. She has always been able to read me. "What happened?" I whispered so Daniel wouldn't hear. I told her about the message. I read it to her word for word. There was a silence on the other end of the line that lasted perhaps 5 seconds. "Don't touch him," Angela said. "Don't wake him up. Don't say a single word tonight." "I know," I said. "Do you have somewhere you can go tomorrow morning without him knowing?" "I'll say I have errands." "Good. Come to me. Bring your laptop." I hung up. I put my phone back on the nightstand. I lay in the dark next to my husband, the man I had built my entire adult life with, and I counted the things I was about to lose. The house, the shared history, the version of my life that made sense, the image of our family that I had held so carefully, the one I had defended even when the evidence began quietly stacking against it. I counted those losses the way you count the days after a death, methodically, because the alternative is to drown. I did not sleep that night. I watched the ceiling lighten from black to gray to pale blue as dawn came through the curtains. I listened to Daniel breathe. I thought about 4 years. 4 years meant it had started in year 7 of our marriage. Lily had been 10. Mason had been 7. Whatever this was, it had been happening in the background of school plays and birthday parties and Sunday pot roasts and every ordinary Tuesday of our lives. The fear came in the morning, not the grief. That would come later. The fear was specific and practical. What do I do now, and how do I not make a mistake? Because I knew one thing clearly. If I confronted Daniel without evidence, without a plan, without legal protection, I would lose. He was smart. He was careful. Careful enough to maintain a 4-year secret. If I walked into that conversation unprepared, he would deny it. He would turn it around. He would tell me I was paranoid, that the message was from a troubled woman, that I was destroying our family over an Instagram notification from a stranger. I had seen this happen to other women. I would not let it happen to me. I got up, made breakfast for the kids, and kissed Daniel on the cheek when he came downstairs. He smelled like sleep and familiar soap. I handed him his coffee and told him I had some errands to run after school. He said okay without looking up from his phone. Angela's apartment was across town on the 4th floor of a building near the university where she taught sociology. I arrived at her door at 9:15 in the morning, still in my work clothes, with a paper cup of gas station coffee and approximately no ability to make small talk. She opened the door, looked at my face, and said nothing. She just stepped aside to let me in. We sat at her kitchen table with both our laptops open. The first thing we did was look up Renata Voss. Her Instagram was partially public. She was 32 years old, worked as a graphic designer, and lived, according to her location tags, in Asheville, which was, I noted with a cold precision, exactly 47 miles from our house. The restaurant receipt. Angela and I looked at each other. "Okay," she said. "Before you do anything emotional, you do everything practical. You understand?" I understood. She pulled up a list on her laptop, a divorce attorney she had researched months ago for a colleague. "You call her Monday," Angela said. "You say nothing to Daniel before you speak to a lawyer. Nothing." Then she said something I hadn't expected. "Check your finances. Today. All of it." I spent the next 2 hours going through our joint accounts on my phone while Angela made notes. What I found made my stomach clench. Over the past 2 years, small withdrawals had accumulated into something substantial. Cash withdrawals, transfers I didn't recognize, a credit card I hadn't known existed until I pulled Daniel's credit report using a service Angela helped me navigate. The card had a balance of just under $9,000. He had been funding another life, a quiet parallel life, 47 miles away. My plan had 3 parts. First, a lawyer. Second, financial documentation, everything copied and preserved. Third, confirmation, because the message from Renata Voss was not by itself proof of anything a court would care about. I needed more. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I moved a single piece on the board. I drove home in time to start dinner. I set the table. I called the kids in. Daniel sat across from me and asked about my day. "Good," I said. "Yours?" "Same as always," he said. I smiled. I passed him the salad, and somewhere beneath the ice in my chest, something that was not quite anger and not quite grief began to organize itself into something much more purposeful. I called the attorney Monday morning from my car in the school parking lot before first period. Her name was Susan Hale, and Angela had described her as the woman you want in your corner when the other side doesn't play fair. She had a calm, unhurried voice and the kind of directness I needed. When I finished explaining the situation, the message, the receipt, the credit card, the Asheville connection, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Mrs. Whitfield, do not move any money. Do not change any passwords, and do not tell your husband you've spoken to me. Come in Thursday at 4. "Can I collect evidence on my own?" I asked. "Document everything you already have access to," she said carefully. "Bank statements, credit card statements, anything in a joint account, screenshots of the Instagram message. Do not access accounts that are solely in his name, and do not hire anyone without talking to me first." I thanked her and walked into school and taught 2 classes on The Great Gatsby with what I can only describe as a perfectly maintained surface, underneath which absolutely nothing was calm. Thursday's appointment with Susan changed the shape of what I was doing. She explained my rights clearly, walked me through what equitable distribution looked like in North Carolina, and outlined what documentation would matter most. She also told me something that landed quietly but heavily. If Renata's pregnancy was real and the child was Daniel's, it would have financial implications that extended well beyond our divorce. Child support, potential claims on assets. The situation was not simple. "Is there anything you haven't told me?" she asked at the end. I thought about it. "He doesn't know I know," I said. She nodded slowly. "Keep it that way for now." Meanwhile, something was shifting at home. I don't know what Daniel noticed. Perhaps my silences, perhaps something in my eyes. But he began paying attention to me in a way he hadn't in years. He asked about my day more carefully. He came home earlier. He suggested we get dinner alone that weekend, just the two of us. It should have felt like hope. Instead, it felt like surveillance. I said yes to the dinner. I smiled across the table at a wine bar downtown and watched him talk about work and the kids and a weekend trip he thought we should take in the spring. I said all the right things, and when he reached across the table and took my hand, I let him. But under the table, my other hand was in my lap, and I was holding my phone, and the screenshot of Renata's message was in my camera roll, and I had already sent copies to Angela and to Susan Hale's secure client portal. The direct evidence came 11 days after the first message. I had created a secondary Instagram account, a blank profile with no photo, no posts, no followers. On a Wednesday afternoon, sitting in my classroom after the students had gone, I sent Renata Voss a message from that account. I kept it simple. "I'm in a situation similar to yours. Can we talk?" She responded in 4 hours. We spoke on the phone that evening while Daniel was coaching Mason's soccer practice. Renata's voice was younger than I expected. Not hard, not theatrical, but careful. She asked who I was. I told her I was Daniel's wife. There was a long silence. Then she said, "I didn't think you'd actually reach out." "Did you mean what you wrote?" I asked. "Every word," she said. And then she said something that took the floor out from under me. "He told me 2 months ago he was going to ask you for a divorce. He said he was just waiting for the right time. He had told her he was leaving me. He had made her a promise. And in the meantime, he had suggested a spring trip and held my hand at dinner." Renata agreed to send me documentation. Over the next 48 hours, she forwarded a thread of text messages between her and Daniel, stretching back over 3 years. Hotel reservations, conversations about the pregnancy, photographs of them together in places I recognized and places I didn't. There was a photo taken in our kitchen. He had brought her into our home. I sat with that for a very long time. Then I forwarded everything to Susan Hale. "This is your point of no return," Susan told me. "Once we file, there's no quiet resolution." "I'm not looking for quiet," I said. Susan filed the petition for divorce on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Daniel had been served at his office. I know this because Angela was parked across the street. She texted me one word, "Done." I was standing in front of my third period class explaining the symbolism of the green light in Gatsby when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I finished the sentence I was saying. I moved on to the next paragraph. I did not check my phone until the bell rang. Daniel called 4 times between noon and 2 o'clock. I let it go to voicemail each time. His messages ranged from stunned to confused to something that was trying very hard to sound reasonable and calm. "Claire, please call me back. We need to talk. Whatever you've heard, please just let me explain." I drove home after school, picked up Mason from practice, started dinner. Daniel arrived at 6:15. I heard his car in the driveway. I heard his key in the lock. He walked into the kitchen and looked at me like I was a stranger. "You filed for divorce," he said. "Yes," I said. "Claire, "The kids are upstairs doing homework," I said. "We're not having this conversation now." He opened his mouth. He closed it. He sat down at the kitchen table like a man who has just realized the ground beneath him is not solid. We had a version of the conversation he wanted 2 nights later, once the kids were at Angela's. He tried denial first, brief, unconvincing, then acknowledgement, careful, minimizing, then apology, which is where he spent the most time because he had always known that I was someone who believed in forgiveness. "She meant nothing," he said. I noted he did not say it meant nothing. "She's pregnant, Daniel." He flinched. "We don't know for certain." "She sent me 3 years of text messages," I said, "including the one where you told her you'd leave me." The color left his face. That was the moment Renata Voss stopped being Daniel's secret and became his problem. Because what I had not anticipated, what I should have anticipated, was that Renata had her own ideas about how this should go. 2 days after Daniel was served, she called him, and apparently, whatever she said to him, it prompted him to call his mother. Lorraine Whitfield arrived at my front door on Saturday morning with a pie and an expression that had not changed in 20 years. Immovable, particular, certain that the correct shape of the world was whichever shape benefited her son. She was 68, church-going, and had always treated my competence as a mild personal affront. "Claire," she said, as though she were the one owed an explanation. I opened the door wide and did not invite her in. She told me I was making a mistake. She told me that marriages go through difficulties, that Daniel was a good man who had made an error, that the children needed their father. She told me that Renata was unstable, manipulative, that Daniel had tried to end things with her months ago, and she had refused to let go. She told me that if I pushed forward with this divorce, I would regret it. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "Lorraine, I need you to leave my property. My attorney will be the appropriate point of contact going forward." Her expression shifted, not hurt, not surprised, but something colder. "You'll be sorry," she said. It was not a comfort, it was a warning. 3 days later, I received an email from an attorney I didn't recognize, representing Daniel. It suggested, in extremely polished language, that proceeding with the divorce as filed would raise certain questions about my fitness as a primary residential parent, referencing, vaguely, documented instances of emotional instability. There were no details because there were no instances. It was a threat constructed from nothing, but it was designed to make me feel like I was standing on unstable ground. I forwarded it to Susan within the hour. "They're rattled," she said. "This is what rattled looks like." That weekend, I took the kids to the mountains. Not far, just a rented cabin 2 hours east, with a fireplace and no cell signal and nothing that needed to be decided for 48 hours. Lily read. Mason hiked every trail twice. I sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the trees and let the cold air do what cold air does, clear everything down to what is essential. I was not fine, but I was clear. And clarity, I was learning, was its own form of strength. When I returned from the mountains, there was a letter on my kitchen counter. Daniel still had a key. That was the first thing I handled Monday morning. A locksmith arrived at 8, and by 9 o'clock the locks were changed, and a copy of the new key was in my bag, and another was with Angela. The letter was handwritten. 3 pages Daniel's penmanship, which I had always found reliable and steady, and which now seemed like a code I had misread. He wrote about our history, the early years, specific memories, the night Mason was born, the trip we took to Vermont when Lily was 6. He wrote that he had lost himself and found himself afraid to admit it. He wrote that he loved me. Then, near the end, he wrote, "I want to come home. We can get through this. Think about what we'd be giving up." It was beautifully written. It was also, when I examined it clearly, a campaign. Every memory he had selected was one in which I had been happy and he had been the reason. Every phrase that followed was a subtle pressure. Think of the children. Think of the house. Think of what you'll lose. He had not written, "Think of what I did to you." He had not written, "Think of her and the child and the years of dishonesty." He had written only about what I stood to lose by moving forward. Nothing about what I had already lost by staying. I read the letter twice, set it on the table, and made coffee. My phone rang. "Unknown number," I answered. It was Renata. She had, it seemed, become aware of the letter. Daniel had apparently shown it to her, or she had found it, or some other version of events had occurred that she did not explain clearly. What she said was this: "He's trying to go back to you. He told me this morning he thinks you'll drop the case." "I won't," I said. A pause. "I need to know what's going to happen to my baby." Her voice had lost its earlier steadiness. "He's not answering my calls. He told me I need to talk to his lawyer." I felt something then that I had not expected. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. She had been lied to as well. Whatever her choices had been, she had been told promises that Daniel had had no intention of keeping. He had used both of us. "I can't advise you," I said carefully, "but I'd suggest you get your own attorney, one who represents your interests only." "Why would you tell me that?" "Because your child will need someone looking out for them," I said. "And right now, that person isn't their father." I hung up. I sat with the quiet for a long time. The support I found came from unexpected places. The first was my colleague at school, Patricia. She taught history, had been through a divorce 6 years prior, and had never once made me feel pitied when I finally told her what was happening. She brought me lunch in my classroom 3 times a week and sat across from me and talked about entirely normal things. And that was exactly what I needed, to be treated as a full person, not a situation. The second was a support group Angela had found, women navigating divorce and co-parenting, meeting on Thursday evenings in the back room of a church on the east side. I went twice before I decided it was the kind of thing I needed to keep going to. These were women who had survived. They were not broken. They were practical and occasionally funny and completely without illusions. And when I walked into that room, I stopped feeling like I was the only person who had ever had to rebuild from this particular kind of ruin. The third came from Lily. She had sensed the change in the house long before we sat her and Mason down and told them carefully that Dad was going to be living somewhere else for a while. She had not cried. She'd asked 3 precise questions, listened to the answers, and then said, "Okay." Later that night, she came into my room and sat on the edge of my bed and said, "Mom, you're going to be okay, right?" "Yes," I said, and for the first time in months, I actually believed it. It was a Sunday in January, 4 weeks into the official divorce proceedings, when they arrived together. I had not expected that. I had expected Daniel alone, or Lorraine alone, or perhaps another letter, another email from his attorney with veiled implications. What I had not expected was Daniel's car in my driveway at 11 in the morning with Lorraine in the passenger seat, both of them walking to my door with the deliberate, coordinated calm of people who had rehearsed. I watched them from the kitchen window for a moment before I answered. Daniel was holding a paper bag, pastries, I assumed, from the bakery we had always gone to on Sunday mornings. The gesture was precise. It said, "This is a peace offering. This is familiar. This is safe." Lorraine was dressed carefully, no coat despite the cold, which told me she had not expected to be kept on the porch. I opened the door. "Claire," Daniel said, "can we come in? Please. We just want to talk." "About what?" I said. "About the kids," he said. "About doing this in a way that doesn't destroy everything." I stepped back and let them in because I was not afraid of a conversation. I knew what I knew, and nothing they could say in my kitchen would change the paperwork already filed with the Mecklenburg County Courthouse. We sat at the kitchen table. Daniel had brought croissants. I did not offer coffee. He spoke first, and he spoke well. I'll give him that. He acknowledged what he had done. He said the word wrong. He talked about the children, their stability, the importance of keeping as much of their world intact as possible. He spoke about the house, about finances, about how a prolonged legal battle would cost us both things we couldn't afford to lose. Then Lorraine spoke, and that is where the mask slipped. She started with sympathy. "For me," she said, "for what I had been through, for the position I had been put in." Then she moved, smoothly and quickly, to the idea that this was a private family matter, and that involving attorneys and courts was a way of making it something ugly and public when it didn't need to be. She mentioned the children twice in 2 sentences. She said the word dignity. "What a divorce like this does to a woman," she said, "especially a woman in a public-facing job like teaching. The talk, Claire, the things people say. You'd be protecting yourself, really, by keeping this quiet." There it was, my reputation, my job, what people would say. She was offering me silence in exchange for retreat, dressing it as protection when it was a threat. "Lorraine," I said, "are you suggesting I drop the divorce proceedings to preserve my professional reputation?" "I'm suggesting," she said carefully, "that there are ways to handle this that don't require the whole county knowing your business." Daniel was watching me. His expression was the one I had come to recognize in these past weeks, the one that was waiting to see which version of me would show up, the one who smoothed things over or the one who would change the locks. "I'd like you both to leave," I said. Daniel's careful composure cracked slightly. "Claire, I have Susan Hale's number if you'd like to discuss anything further," I said. "Beyond that, this conversation is over." Lorraine stood up slowly. She looked at me with an expression that was not quite contempt, but was close enough to recognize. "You're making a mistake you won't be able to undo," she said. "I made those for 11 years, I said. "I'm done now." They left. I stood at the window and watched the car back out of the driveway, and then I sat down at the kitchen table in the empty house and pressed my hands flat against the wood. My heart was going faster than I would have liked. My hands were not entirely steady. They had rattled something in me. Not my conviction, but something underneath it. Some nerve that fear still had access to. The thought, What if they find something to use against me? What if Lorraine knows something I don't? What if this gets uglier than I'm prepared for? I sat with that fear. I did not try to reason it away. And then I picked up my phone and called Susan Hale and told her exactly what had just happened. Every word in order. "Good," she said when I finished. "Write it all down while it's fresh. Dates, times, everything that was said. This is relevant." I wrote it down, all 4 pages, and the fear, rather than growing, became something I could hold in my hand, sharp and clarifying. They were afraid of what I knew. That was why they had come. Not to make peace, to make me smaller. I was not going to be smaller. The deposition was scheduled for the first Thursday in March. Susan had been strategic about the timing. We had spent 2 months building a documentation of the marriage. Financial records, the credit card history, the transferred funds, the 3 years of text messages Renata had provided, hotel records Susan's investigator had pulled, and one additional item that had come to light 6 weeks prior, a second account, not a credit card. A savings account Daniel had opened 4 years ago at a bank where we had no shared history, into which he had been making monthly deposits. The account had a balance of $41,000. He had been building an exit fund. I had not confronted him with any of this, not a word. I had let him continue his pattern of weekend texts, asking to see the kids, occasional emails through the attorneys that were always slightly too warm and slightly too careful. I had responded appropriately and given nothing away. The deposition took place in Susan's conference room, neutral, bright, unremarkable. Daniel arrived with his attorney, a man named Garrett Fossey, who wore a very good suit and had the polished manner of someone accustomed to winning on presentation. Lorraine had wanted to attend. Susan had ensured she could not. Daniel looked tired. He had lost some weight. He smiled at me when he sat down, the kind of smile that was trying to seem natural and did not manage it. The first hour was procedural. Questions about the marriage, the household, financial responsibilities, parenting arrangements. Daniel's answers were measured. Fossey had prepared him well. Then Susan began asking about the savings account. The first moment of fracture was small. A pause where there should have been no pause. A glance at Fossey that lasted a half-second too long. Daniel said he had opened the account as a personal savings vehicle, that it was common for spouses to maintain individual accounts, that there was nothing unusual about it. "Can you explain the deposit schedule?" Susan asked, and slid a document across the table. He looked at it. "I was setting aside money for—" He stopped, started again. "For future expenses." "What future expenses?" Another pause. "Various." "Mr. Whitfield, were any of the funds in this account used to support Renata Voss?" Voss objected on form. Susan rephrased, asked it 3 different ways across the next 15 minutes until the record contained enough evasions and contradictions to be legible to any judge in the county. Then we came to the text messages. Susan presented them in sequence, printed, annotated, authenticated by Renata's own signed statement, which she had provided 2 weeks prior through her attorney. Renata had, in the end, retained excellent counsel. She was pursuing her own claims, which ran parallel to mine and occasionally intersected in ways that were, for Daniel, extremely inconvenient. When the messages appeared on the table, something happened to Daniel's face. It was not theatrical. It was small and quick, a flicker, like a light going out behind glass. He had believed, I think, even until that moment, that there was some version of this he could manage, some version in which the right words, the right expression, the right attorney could contain what he had done. "Mr. Whitfield," Susan said, "in this message from October of 3 years ago, you wrote to Ms. Voss that," and I'm quoting directly from the authenticated record, "that you would handle things on the home front within the year. Can you explain what you meant by handle things?" He looked at Fossey. Fossey said something quiet that I couldn't hear. Daniel looked back at Susan. It was a figure of speech. "A figure of speech," Susan repeated. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at him the way you look at something that is not going to change into what you need it to be. "And in this message from February 2 years ago, you wrote that you had moved enough to cover 6 months in the new place. Can you tell me what the new place refers to?" Fossey objected. Susan marked the question for the record. The deposition lasted 4 hours. By the end, Daniel had contradicted himself on the savings account 3 times, on the duration of the relationship twice, and on the kitchen photograph, which Susan presented last, quietly without comment. Not at all. He simply stopped talking. Fossey called for a break. They did not return to the table. I walked out of Susan's office into the March afternoon with the sun doing something ordinary and bright, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed. I did not feel triumphant. I felt strangely still, as if something that had been braced against impact could finally, carefully, release. Susan came out 2 minutes later. "Fossey will call tomorrow," she said. "They're going to want to talk settlement." "I know," I said. "How are you?" I thought about it. "Ready," I said. Foss called the next morning. He was gracious about it, which is what you are when you are on the losing side and you know it, and professional dignity is all that remains. He used words like collaborative resolution and mutual benefit and the interests of the children, which I had come to recognize as language that means my client would like to lose as little as possible. Susan and I had discussed this. We had prepared for it. The settlement negotiation took 3 weeks, conducted entirely through attorneys, which is how it should have been conducted from the beginning. Daniel's offer was not initially reasonable. It preserved too much for him and too little for the children, and contained a clause about Renata's situation that attempted to insulate him from financial responsibility in ways that Susan identified as legally untenable. We declined, countered, waited. His second offer was better. His third was close. The final settlement, which Daniel signed on the last Friday in April, gave me the house, fully with his name removed from the mortgage through a refinance he was required to facilitate. It gave me primary residential custody of both Lily and Mason, with a structured visitation schedule that Susan had negotiated carefully to include accountability provisions. It gave me a fair division of our assets, including a substantial portion of the $41,000 savings account, which the court had been very interested in. It required him to carry health insurance for both children until they were 26, and to contribute to their college funds on a schedule that was written into the agreement with enough specificity that deviation would constitute contempt of court. It also required him to acknowledge, in writing as part of the settlement terms, that his financial conduct during the marriage had been deceptive, That last part had not been easy to get. Fosse had pushed back on it considerably. Susan had held the line. I had wanted it not for the public record. It would not be public, but for myself. Because the 11 years I had spent telling myself everything was fine deserved a document that said plainly it wasn't. Lorraine was not part of the settlement because Lorraine had never had any legal standing to be. The Sunday kitchen visit had been captured in my written record, submitted to Susan, and noted in the correspondence. It had done what it was always going to do, nothing that helped her and something that helped me. Renata signed a separate agreement with Daniel's attorney 2 weeks after ours. I was not a party to it and was not told the terms. I know only what her attorney, in a brief professional courtesy called Susan, indicated. That provision had been made for the child. Whether Daniel felt anything about becoming a father under those circumstances, I cannot say. I had stopped trying to understand the interior life of a man who had managed, for 4 years, to have no interior life I could access at all. What I had not expected was how anticlimactic the actual moment of signing would feel. I had imagined something. Relief, perhaps, or the clean snap of a door closing. Instead, it was a Thursday afternoon in a conference room that smelled of printer toner and cold coffee, and Susan slid the document across the table, and I signed my name in 4 places and initialed 3 more, and that was that. 11 years, 4 years of deception, months of documentation and strategy and fear and resolve. And it ended in 12 minutes with a pen on a table while someone's assistant typed in the next room. But driving home, something shifted. The light on the highway was doing something particular. That late afternoon gold that Charlotte gets in spring, the kind that makes even ordinary exits look significant. I turned the radio up. I did not cry. I sang along to something I hadn't heard in years, badly, without caring. The day the settlement was finalized, I picked up Lily from school. She was taking AP History and had a project due. And then picked up Mason from soccer practice. We drove through and got milkshakes. Mason explained to me at length why chocolate peanut butter was objectively the only correct choice. Lily argued for strawberry with the intensity of someone who has decided to have opinions about things. We drove home with the windows down, even though it was still a little cold, and Biscuit stuck his head out the back window, and his ears went flat in the wind, and Mason laughed so hard he nearly spilled his milkshake. I pulled into the driveway of my house, the house that was mine. I sat there for a moment after the kids had gotten out, doors slamming behind them, Biscuit bounding after, the ordinary noise of them carrying through the evening air. And I thought, I did not collapse. I did not retreat. I did not become someone I wasn't in order to survive someone who was. Then I went inside and started dinner. A year later, my life looked like this. I was still teaching. I had, in fact, been offered a department head position in the spring, which I had accepted after 3 days of deliberation and one conversation with Patricia, in which she told me I was the most qualified person in the building and to stop deliberating. My classroom had new bookshelves. I had finally bought them, and a window that I'd gotten permission to repaint the frame of because the previous green had been bothering me for 6 years. The house was different in ways that were hard to articulate. Not quieter. The kids were teenagers, and quiet was not on their available settings, but lighter. There were more impromptu Saturday mornings, more dinners that became conversations, more evenings where Lily read on the couch and Mason did homework on the kitchen floor with biscuits sprawled across his feet, and I graded papers at the table, and the absence of tension was its own kind of presence. I had started running again, not for anyone, not toward anything in particular, just for the specific pleasure of moving through the neighborhood in the early morning when it was still half dark and the air was cold and my mind went quiet in a way it almost never does otherwise. I had taken up one more thing that surprised me, a ceramics class on Tuesday evenings at the Community Arts Center. I was not talented. The first 3 bowls I made were lopsided in ways that amused Mason considerably. But there was something about working with your hands at something that had no stakes, no judgment, no consequence if the bowl collapsed. Something about that felt like an antidote to the years of careful maintenance, of holding everything exactly in place. I kept going. By spring, I had made something that could hold water without apology, and I put it on the kitchen windowsill where the morning light hit it, and I found I was genuinely pleased with it in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else's opinion. That felt new. That felt important. The Thursday evening support group had become something I looked forward to rather than attended out of obligation. Several of the women had become real friends, the kind forged in the particular honesty that comes when you have all seen each other at your most uncertain and chosen to show up anyway. We had dinner together outside the group setting now, argued about restaurants, texted about our children's inexplicable decisions. One of them, a woman named Diane, who had been through something considerably messier than my situation, had started a small business and asked me to proofread her website copy, which I did, and she sent me a plant in return, which was still alive on my desk and which I considered a minor miracle. Angela came to dinner at least twice a month. She brought wine. She had in September started seeing someone, a history professor, dry-humored, who she described as aggressively adequate in all the right ways, which I understood to be high praise from her. I had not been looking for anything, and I was not looking. But I had coffee one Saturday with a man named James, who taught at the university and ran the same trail I did on weekend mornings. And it was good coffee and a good conversation, and I drove home feeling, for the first time in a very long time, like someone who might, at some unscheduled future point, be open to something. Not yet, but the door was no longer locked. As for Daniel, he was living in an apartment in Asheville. This I knew from the custody exchange schedule, which required occasional logistical coordination. He had taken a job at a smaller firm with less prestige, and presumably the appeal of proximity to Renata. He had moved into a 2-bedroom apartment that Mason described, without editorializing, as pretty small. I did not editorialize either. Renata had given birth in February, a girl. I knew the name only because Mason told me, matter-of-factly, that his dad had a new daughter. I said that was important news and asked how he felt about it. He shrugged and went back to his homework in the way that only 11-year-olds can make look completely natural. Daniel and Renata were not, from what I could piece together without looking particularly hard, happy. The relationship that had survived on distance and promise had encountered, as such relationships tend to, the reality of a small apartment and a newborn, and the specific quality of a man who had not been honest with the first woman he had made a life with. She had apparently discovered his calendar, a detail I heard from the same mutual acquaintance with what I recognized as Justice's quiet, efficient humor. He had not changed his patterns. He had simply changed their audience. There was talk through the same quiet channels that Renata had consulted an attorney of her own, not about the baby's provision, which was already settled, but about other things. I did not follow up. It was no longer my story to track. Lorraine was not speaking to me, which suited us both. She had transferred her campaign to the children, which Susan had noted in our original custody provisions, and the provisions had thus far been sufficient to address it. Lily, who was 15 and fully in possession of her own considered opinions, had told her grandmother once, plainly and without cruelty, that she would be happy to talk about anything except things that were about the divorce stuff. And Lorraine had found this boundary so unexpected from a 15-year-old that she had, reportedly, had nothing to say. Lily told me this at dinner one evening with the small, contained satisfaction of someone who has handled something exactly right. "How did she react?" I asked. "She looked surprised," Lily said. "And then?" "And then she changed the subject." Lily picked up her fork. "So I think it worked." I looked at my daughter, clear-eyed, precise, kind in the way that is harder than it looks, and felt something that I had felt rarely in the years of careful maintenance: uncomplicated pride. I had not just survived this. I had, without quite planning to, shown my children something about how to be a person when everything is falling apart. That turned out to matter more than I had expected. The truth does not require your permission to exist. What you can choose is when you look at it, and what you do once you have. I chose to look. I chose to be strategic before I was emotional, practical before I was reactive. Not because I am exceptional, because I understood that collapsing was a luxury I could not afford. Every woman who has sat in the dark next to someone she no longer